Federal funding has flowed in this war to those state and local law enforcement agencies that boost the sheer numbers of drug arrests. It's been a numbers game. Law enforcement agencies have been rewarded in cash for the sheer numbers of people swept into the system for drug offenses, which helps to explain why so many police officers go out looking for the so-called low-hanging fruit, stopping, frisking, searching, tossing as many people as possible in an effort to get their numbers up. And to make matters worse, federal drug forfeiture laws allow state and local law enforcement agencies to keep for their own use up to 80% of the cash, cars, homes seized from suspected drug offenders. You don't have to be convicted, just suspected of a drug offense. Law enforcement could take your cash, seize your car, thus granting to law enforcement a direct monetary interest, not in ending drug abuse or drug addiction or drug-related crime, but in the longevity of this war itself. And the results have been predictable. People of color have been arrested en masse for primarily non-violent drug offenses. In 2005, for example, 4 out of 5 drug arrests were for simple possession. Only 1 out of 5 were sales. Most people in state prison for drug offenses have no history of violence or even significant selling activity. And in the 1990s, the period of the greatest escalation of the drug war, nearly 80% of the increase in drug arrests were for marijuana possession, a drug that's been shown to be less harmful, or at least less addictive than alcohol or tobacco, and at least, if not more prevalent, in middle-class white communities and on college campuses as it is in the hood. But by waging this war almost exclusively in the hood, we've managed to create this vast new racial undercaste in an astonishingly short period of time. Now, where has the U.S. Supreme Court been in all of this? Where has the U.S. Supreme Court been? Well, far from protecting the interests of discrete and insular minorities, far from doing that, the U.S. Supreme Court has been busy defending this war at every turn. The U.S. Supreme Court over the last couple of decades has eviscerated Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches and seizures, granting to the police the authority to stop, frisk, search just about anyone, anywhere, without any probable cause or reasonable suspicion, not a shred of evidence of criminal activity, as long as they get consent. Now, what's consent? Consent is when a police officer walks up to a young man. Officer walks up to a young man with one hand on his gun and says, "Son, put your arms up in the air so I can search you, see if you got anything on you." Kid says, "Uh-huh." That young man just waived his Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable searches and seizures. Law enforcement doesn't have to have a shred of evidence to support that frisk now that the young man has consented, of course, believing that he really had no ability to refuse consent and walk away. Now, you might say, well, these are just isolated instances, but the reality is these isolated incidents add up to enormous racial disparities. The New York Police Department reported that in 1 year alone, just 1 year alone, it stopped and frisked more than 600,000 people. 1 year alone. Overwhelmingly black and brown men. But the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that we cannot challenge these racial disparities in a court of law. In a series of cases beginning with McCleskey versus Kemp and Armstrong versus United States, the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled explicitly that it doesn't matter how overwhelming the statistical evidence might be. It does not matter how severe the racial disparities are. Unless you can offer proof of conscious intentional bias, tantamount to an admission by a police officer or a law enforcement official, you can't even state a claim for racial bias in the criminal justice system today. So many of the racial profiling cases that I was litigating 10 years ago can't even be filed today. The U.S. Supreme Court has closed the courthouse doors to claims of racial bias at every stage of the criminal justice process, from stops and searches to plea bargaining and sentencing. In so many ways, the U.S. Supreme Court has effectively immunized this system of mass incarceration from judicial scrutiny for racial bias, much in the same way that the U.S. Supreme Court once rallied to the defense of slavery and rallied again to the defense of Jim Crow in earlier eras. But of course, just being swept into the system with little hope of being able to challenge the bias or tactics that got you there is just the beginning for so many, because once you've been swept in and branded a criminal or felon, you're then ushered into a parallel social universe in which the very rights supposedly won in the civil rights movement no longer apply to you. You may be denied the right to vote for a period of years or the rest of your life, depending on the state you live in. You're deemed ineligible for jury service for the rest of your life if you've been branded a felon. For the rest of your life, discrimination in employment will not only be legal, but absolutely routine. You'll be forced to check that box on employment applications asking the dreaded question, have you ever been convicted of a felony? And it doesn't matter if that felony happened a few weeks ago, a few months ago, or 45 years ago. For the rest of your life, you gotta check that box, knowing full well your application's going straight to the trash. Many people will say to me, oh, come on, stop making excuses for people. Yeah, you know, when you get out of prisons, it's hard, it's tough, but if you try hard, I mean, if you really work at it, put yourself out there some, you know, you can get a job. I mean, you could get a job at McDonald's or Burger King or something. Getting a job at McDonald's is no easy feat if you have a felony record. Housing discrimination, perfectly legal and absolutely routine. Released from prison, public housing projects, as well as private landlords free to discriminate against you, close their doors. Discrimination in public benefits, legal and routine. In fact, under federal law, you are deemed ineligible even for food stamps for the rest of your life if you've been convicted of a drug felony. Now, fortunately, many states have now opted out of the federal ban on food stamps for drug offenders. But it's still the case that hundreds, thousands of people can't even get food stamps to feed themselves because they were once caught with drugs. Now, what are people released from prison expected to do? You're tossed out on the curb. Can't get a job. Can't get housing. Even food stamps might be off limits to you. What are you expected to do? Well, apparently what we expect people to do is to pay hundreds or thousands of dollars in fees, fines, court costs, accumulated back child support, which continues to accrue while you're in prison. And in a growing number of states, you're then expected to pay back the costs of your imprisonment. And paying back all these fees, fines, court costs, accumulated back child support may well be a condition of your probation or parole. And then get this. If you're one of the lucky few, the very few, who actually manages to get a job right out of prison, up to 100% of your wages could be garnished. 100%. To pay back all those fees, fines, court costs, accumulated back child support. What are people released from prison expected to do? I mean, when you take a step back from this system as a whole, take a step back and see the impoverished, underfunded schools. You see the children who are hounded by the police, stopped and frisked on their way to and from school. When they're old enough to drive, their cars are pulled over, searched. When they're swept in for committing some usually relatively minor crime. One's first arrest is usually some relatively minor crime or drug offense, the very sorts of crimes that occur with roughly equal frequency in middle-class white communities or on college campuses, but go largely ignored. Once you're swept in, then you're ushered into this parallel social universe unable to work, find shelter, or even food? When you step back and take a look at this, what does the system seem designed to do? Seems, in my view, designed to send folks right back to prison, which is what, in fact, happens the vast majority of the time. About 70% of people released from prison return within a few years, and the majority of those who return in some states do so in a matter of months, because the challenges associated with mere survival on the outside are so immense. Now, why did we choose this path? How did we get ourselves here? All these years after Dr. King has passed away. Well, it's clear to me that in the years since Dr. King's death, our nation was faced with a choice. We could continue down the path that Dr. King was traveling, the path of compassion, forgiveness, inclusion, and hope. We could choose the path of the poor people's movement he was plotting. We could join him in the revolution of values he prayed for. Or we could take a different road, a road more familiar when it comes to matters of race, the road of exclusion, division, punitiveness, and despair. One day, I believe, historians will look back on this era of mass incarceration and they will say, it was there, right there at the prison gates, that we abandoned Dr. King's dream and took a dramatic U-turn, a U-turn that would leave millions of people permanently locked up and locked out. We have now spent $1 trillion waging the drug war since it began. $1 trillion. Funds that could have been used for education, job creation, drug treatment. We're constantly being told there's not enough money to pay teachers. There's not enough money for small class sizes. There's not enough money for jobs programs for youth. There's not enough money. There's not enough money for poor people. Well, apparently we had $1 trillion to blow. And we decided to spend it, rather than on education or job creation, we decided to spend it building a prison system unlike anything the world has ever known. So what do we do? What do we do now? Well, my own view is that nothing short of a major social movement has any hope of ending mass incarceration and inspiring a recommitment to Dr. King's dream. Now, if you think that that sounds extreme, that surely something less would do now, consider this. If we were to return to the rates of incarceration we had in the 1970s or the early 1980s, before the war on drugs and the Get Tough movement truly kicked off, we would have to release 4 out of 5 people who are in prison today. 4 out of 5. More than 1 million people employed by the criminal justice system would need to find a new line of work. Most new prison construction has occurred in predominantly white rural communities, communities that have been sold on prisons as an answer to their economic woes, that now believe that prisons are a source for jobs, desperately needed jobs in their communities. And very often, prisons are advertised as providing far more benefits to these communities than they actually deliver. But nonetheless, so many of these communities now believe that their economies depend on prisons. Those prisons across America would have to close down. Private prison companies now listed on the New York Stock Exchange and doing quite well even in a time of economic recession. Those companies would be forced into bankruptcy. This system of mass incarceration is now so deeply rooted in our social, political, and economic structure that it is not going to just fade away or downsize out of sight without a major upheaval, a fairly radical shift in our public consciousness. Now, I know that there's many people today who will say, oh, you know, there's no hope of ending mass incarceration in America, no, there's no hope. Pick another issue. Just as many people were resigned to Jim Crow in the South and would say, yeah, that's a shame, it's a shame, but that's just the way that it is. I find that so many people today view the millions cycling in and out of our prisons and jails today as just an unfortunate but inalterable fact of American life. Well, I'm quite certain that Dr. King would not have been so resigned. So I believe that if we are truly to honor Dr. King, if we are to ever catch up with King, we have got to be willing to continue his work. We have got to be willing to go back and pick up where he left off and do the hard work of movement building on behalf of poor people of all colors. In 1968, Dr. King told advocates that the time had come to transition from a civil rights movement to a human rights movement. Meaningful equality, he said, could not be achieved through civil rights alone. Without basic human rights, the right to work, the right to shelter, the right to quality education. Without basic human rights, he said, civil rights are an empty promise. So in honor of Dr. King and all those who labored to end the old Jim Crow, I hope we will commit ourselves to building a human rights movement to end mass incarceration. A movement for education, not incarceration. A movement for jobs, not jails. A movement to end all these forms of legal discrimination against people. Discrimination that denies them basic human rights to work, to shelter, and to food. Now, what must we do to begin this movement? Well, first, I believe we've got to begin by telling the truth, the whole truth. We've got to be willing to admit out loud that we as a nation have managed to recreate a caste-like system in this country. We've got to be willing to tell this truth in our schools, in our churches and our places of worship, behind bars and in reentry centers. We've got to be willing to tell this truth so that a great awakening to the reality of what has occurred can come to pass. Because the reality is that this new caste-like system, it doesn't come with signs. There are no whites-only signs anymore. There are no signs today alerting us to the existence of the system of mass incarceration. And prisons today, they are out of sight and out of mind, often hundreds of miles away from communities and families that might otherwise be connected to them. And the people who cycle in and out of these prisons typically live in segregated, impoverished communities. Communities that middle-class folks, upper middle-class folks rarely come across. So you can live your whole life in America today having no idea that this system of mass incarceration and the harm it wreaks even exists. So we have got to be willing to tell the truth about what has occurred, pull back the curtain and make visible what is hidden in plain sight so that an awakening can begin and people can begin to take the kind of creative, constructive action that this moment in our history surely requires. But of course, just a lot of talk and consciousness raising isn't going to be enough. We've got to be willing to get to work. And in my view, that means we have got to be willing to build an underground railroad for people released from prison. An underground railroad for people who want to make a genuine break for real freedom. People who want to escape this system and find work, find shelter, be able to support their families, find a true freedom in America today. We have got to be willing to open our homes, open our schools, open our workplaces to people returning home from prison and provide safe spaces of support for the families who have loved ones behind bars today. How do we create these safe places? Well, one thing we can certainly do, we can begin to admit our own criminality out loud. Our own criminality. Because the truth is, we've all made mistakes in our lives. We all have. All of us are sinners. All of us have done wrong. All of us have broken the law at some point in our lives. If you're an adult, you've broken the law at some point in your life. Now, I find that some people will say, oh yeah, I'm a sinner, I've made mistakes, but don't call me a criminal. Don't call me a criminal. I say, okay, well, maybe you never drank underage. Maybe you never experimented with drugs. Well, if the worst thing you've done in your entire life is speed 10 miles over the speed limit on the freeway, you've put yourself and others at more risk of harm than someone smoking marijuana in the privacy of their living room. But there are people in the United States serving life sentences for first-time drug offenses. Life sentences. The U.S. Supreme Court upheld life sentences for first-time drug offenders against an Eighth Amendment challenge that such sentences were cruel and unusual in violation of the Eighth Amendment. And the U.S. Supreme Court said, no, it's not cruel and unusual punishment to sentence a young man to life imprisonment for a first-time drug offense, even though virtually no other country in the world does such a thing. So we've got to end this idea that the criminals are them, not us, and instead say, there but for the grace of God go I. All of us have made mistakes in our lives, taken wrong turns, but only some of us have been required to pay for those mistakes for the rest of our lives. In fact, President Barack Obama himself has admitted to more than a little bit of drug use in his lifetime. He's admitted to using marijuana and cocaine in his youth. And if he hadn't been raised by white grandparents in Hawaii, if he hadn't done much of his illegal drug use on predominantly white college campuses and universities, if he had been raised in the hood, the odds are good that he would have been stopped, he would have been frisked, he would have been searched, he would have been caught, and far from being president of the United States today, he might not even have the right to vote, depending on the state he lives in. So we've got to recognize that building this movement is about ensuring the future of all of us, the life chances of all of our young people, so that they can all dream big dreams and join in this project of the American dream. This is a movement we must build on behalf of all of us. It's not about us and them, the people we imagine are the criminals. But of course, building this underground railroad and creating safe spaces isn't going to be enough either. Just as in the days of slavery, it wasn't enough to shuttle a few to freedom one by one on the Underground Railroad, it won't be enough for us to open our hearts and our minds to a few one by one. We're going to have to be willing to work for abolition. That means working for abolition of this system of mass incarceration as a whole. And that means ending the war on drugs once and for all. Ending it. We must shift to a public health model for dealing with drug addiction and drug abuse and stop investing billions of dollars locking people up in prisons and jail cells rather than investing in education and drug treatment and job creation in the communities that need it most. And we have got to end all these forms of legal discrimination against people released from prison. Discrimination that denies them basic human rights to work, to shelter, to food. And last but not least, we have got to shift from a purely punitive approach to dealing with violence and violent crime in our communities to a more rehabilitative and restorative one that takes seriously the interests of the victim, the offender, and the community as a whole. We have got a lot of work to do. And if it seems like too much, if it seems like it can't possibly be done, keep in mind that all of these rules, laws, policies, and practices that constitute this system of mass incarceration, they all rest upon one core belief. And it is the same belief that sustained Jim Crow. It is the belief that some of us are not worthy of genuine care, compassion, and concern. And when we effectively challenge that core belief, this whole system begins to fall like dominoes. A multiracial, multi-ethnic human rights movement must be born, one that is rooted in the awareness of the dignity and humanity of all people. And it's got to be multiracial and multi-ethnic, because although this war on drugs may have been born with Black folks in mind, it is a war that has destroyed the lives of people in communities of all colors. And we see the same get tough rhetoric and divisive racial politics that helped to give birth to the drug war, now leading to another prison building boom, this one aimed at suspected illegal immigrants. So we have got to be willing to connect the dots and build a multiracial, multi-ethnic human rights movement on behalf of all of us. But before this movement can truly get underway, a great awakening is required. We have got to awaken from this colorblind slumber that we've been in to the realities of race in America. And we've got to be willing to embrace those labeled criminals. Not necessarily all their behavior, but them, their humanness. For it has been the refusal and failure to recognize the dignity and humanity of all people that has been the sturdy foundation for every caste system that has ever existed in the United States or anywhere else in the world. It's our task, I firmly believe, to end not just mass incarceration, not just the war on drugs, but to end this history and cycle of caste in America. Then, and only then, can we say with pride that we are finally catching up with King. Thank you so much for having me tonight. Thank you.